And we see an example of how the superior side can seize the opposition in order to force the inferior side out of the queening square and win the game by queening the pawn. This is called a turning maneuver because the white, which is the superior side in our example, is turning into the seventh square and controlling the queening square in order to be able to secure the advance of the pawn. And so this is achieved by white seizing the opposition before it advances the pawn. Now here's what happens if it doesn't seize the opposition first. If white advances the pawn first, then what black simply does is black moves into e8, thereby seizing the opposition against white. Right? If you don't take the opposition, then black certainly will. And so at this point, since the kings are directly opposed, now white cannot win. Okay, so this is what you need to remember. Once the pawn is already on the 6th rank, white will draw the game if black has the opposition. Okay, because right now, white's only move is to either to retreat or to push the pawn. And if white pushes the pawn, black will simply move into the queening square, and there's no way that white can kick the pawn out of there. So it'll just be a drawn game, as we have seen in the previous videos. So this is no good for white. Again, white did not seize the opposition, black did, and now the pawn is already too far advanced for white to win the game. So what white should rather have done is to squeeze, or to actually to exercise a turning maneuver and force the black side to relinquish control of the this queening square. So how does white do that? First, white seizes the opposition. Okay, the king moves to f6. Now, white has just seized the opposition because the kings are directly opposed to each other, and now it's black's turn to act. So black must give ground. So black must move to one side or another. It doesn't really matter which one. So in this example, black turns to the e file. And now white turns. Okay, white turns into the 7th rank. This is why it's called a turning maneuver. And now black's best move is to simply move to d7. And at this point, the game is already over, because at this point white has control of the queening square, meaning that white can support the queening square as the square advances. So it doesn't really matter what black does. At this point, white will win. But the key here is that white utilizes its position in order to secure control of the queening square. Okay, it cannot push the pawn before it does so. So this is a classical example of how to utilize your ability to oppose your opponent and manage to gain the advantage through that. One thing you should notice here is that unlike the previous examples, this pawn is still in the 5th rank. So this is very important because one of the rules that you should remember is that in a king pawn versus king ending, the superior side's king, if the superior side's king is in the rank in front of the pawn, then the superior side will always win. Okay, the superior side needs to know how to go about doing so, like we just described. If the superior side pushes the pawn right now, then it's no good. It'll lose. But it could win. Okay, it's still a winning game if played correctly. And in this case, of course, the king needs to move to f6 in order to win this game. But in this case, if we look at this setup position, without regard of whose turn it is to act, we know that white has a winning game here because white controls one of those 3 files that are within the universe of the pawn. Okay, it's the file that is directly in front of the pawn and the files on its 2 flanks. So if white is positioned on any of those files, on any of those squares, I should say, then white is guaranteed a win. Okay, if played correctly, and yeah, and the pawn is still on the fifth rank, and the king is in front of that pawn. If the pawn is on the second, third, or fourth rank, then the king needs to be 2 ranks in front of the pawn in order to ensure victory. I mean, otherwise, it'll depend on opposition, and opposition will lead you eventually to control one of those squares 2 ranks in front of the pawn, and only so will the superior side be able to win. And we'll see examples of such play in later videos in this series.